Brandon Lancaster let out a frustrated sigh as he checked his watch for the third time in 2 minutes. He had exactly 10 minutes to make it to his meeting on the 52nd floor of the Lancaster Holdings skyscraper, and the last thing he needed was a delay. Dressed in a tailored charcoal suit, he exuded the confidence of a man who had built his million-dollar empire before turning 30. He was used to everything working according to his schedule. The elevator doors slid open, and he stepped inside, barely acknowledging the woman who hurried in right behind him. She was out of breath, her long, dark hair slightly tousled, and she carried an overstuffed tote bag that looked like it was one wrong move away from spilling its contents. "Made it just in time," she muttered, pressing the button for the 40th floor before glancing up at him. Her deep brown eyes met his, and for a split second, something flickered in her gaze recognition. Annoyance. He wasn't sure, nor did he particularly care. Brandon turned his focus back to his watch, calculating how much time he had left before his assistant would blow up his phone. But just as the elevator began its smooth ascent, a sudden jolt made the lights flicker. Then, without warning, everything stopped. The woman gasped, gripping the rail for balance. A tense silence filled the small space before she turned to him, her expression shifting from confusion to alarm. "Did we just—" "Yeah," Brandon said, already pressing the emergency button. "We're stuck." She groaned and leaned her head against the mirrored wall. Of course this would happen today. Brandon wasn't in the mood for small talk. He pulled out his phone, but predictably there was no signal. He tried again as if sheer willpower could change the outcome, but nothing. "Great," he muttered. The woman sighed and crossed her arms. "So I guess we're stuck here together. Perfect." At that, he finally looked at her properly. "Do I know you?" She gave him a dry smile. "Zara Evans." "We met once." Brandon frowned, trying to place her. She didn't look familiar, but the name sparked something in the back of his mind. His company had recently partnered with an interior design firm, and he vaguely remembered a designer named Zara leading the project. "You're working on the penthouse renovation," he said, realization dawning. "Wow, took you that long," she teased. "I was starting to think I was completely forgettable." Brandon wasn't in the habit of remembering every name he came across, but something about her sharp, witty, unbothered by his presence was suddenly very memorable. They stood in tense silence for a moment before Zara exhaled. "Any idea how long this could take?" Brandon ran a hand through his hair. "Could be minutes, could be hours," she groaned. "Wonderful, I have a deadline, and being trapped in an elevator with you was not part of my plan." Brandon raised an eyebrow. "With me?" "Yes, with you." "You're not exactly known for being warm and fuzzy, Lancaster." A slow grin tugged at his lips, so she had opinions about him. "Interesting." "And you're not exactly subtle," he remarked. She shrugged. "No point in pretending otherwise. You're a perfectionist, always in a rush, and probably think this is a bigger inconvenience for you than it is for me." Brandon chuckled despite himself. "You're not wrong." More silence followed, and this time it wasn't as tense. Zara dropped onto the floor, stretching her legs out. "Might as well get comfortable. You're welcome to join me, but I'm guessing sitting on the floor isn't very millionaire businessman of you." Brandon hesitated for a moment, then, to his own surprise, loosened his tie and sat down across from her. "You're full of opinions." "You're full of surprises," she countered. He leaned back against the elevator wall and studied her. She wasn't what he expected. Most people in his world tiptoed around him, careful with their words. But Zara. She didn't seem to care about impressing him. Minutes passed, then an hour. They talked about everything and nothing. Zara told him about her love for design, how she had worked her way up from small projects to major contracts. Brandon found himself telling her things he rarely shared, how exhausting it was to always be in control, how he sometimes wondered if success had made him forget what it felt like to simply breathe. It was strange. He had met countless people, had hundreds of conversations, but none had felt like this. Then, just when the air between them turned a little too charged, the elevator jolted back to life. Zara let out a relieved breath. Looks like our time's up. Brandon stood first, then held out a hand. She hesitated before taking it, her fingers warm against his. As the doors slid open, she turned to him. Well, that was unexpected. Brandon nodded. Very. But as she stepped out, something in him told him this wasn't the last time he'd see her, not even close. Brandon hadn't thought much about Zara Evans after they parted ways in the elevator. At least, that was what he told himself. But as the days passed, her voice, her sharp wit, and the way she had looked at him as if he were just another man, not a millionaire, not a powerful businessman, just a man, kept creeping into his thoughts. It was unsettling. He had meant to move on, bury himself in work as he always did. But then his penthouse renovation hit a snag, and suddenly Zara was back in his orbit. The first time he saw her again, she was standing in the middle of his unfinished living room, arms crossed, speaking to a group of workers with an air of authority that caught him off guard. She wasn't just competent, she owned the space, directing the project with a confidence he couldn't ignore. When she finally noticed him, her expression shifted slightly: surprise, amusement, and something else he couldn't place. "Ah, the infamous Brandon Lancaster," she said, tilting her head. "I was beginning to think you only existed in boardrooms and malfunctioning elevators." He took a step forward, slipping his hands into his pockets. "I make appearances when necessary." She gestured to the half-finished room. "And is this one of those times?" He glanced around, noting the progress. "I heard there was an issue with the design adjustments." Zara sighed, rubbing her temple. "Your original request for the custom shelving doesn't work with the new structural reinforcements. We have two options: compromise on the design or reinforce the entire section at triple the cost and double the time." Brandon studied her, noting the way she waited for his response, not with nervousness, but with the quiet confidence of someone who knew their work inside out. "Go with the first option," he said. "If you think it'll still look good." She arched a brow. "Are you saying you trust my judgment?" He held her gaze. "I wouldn't have hired you if I didn't." For a moment, something flickered between them, an unspoken understanding. Then Zara turned back to the workers, giving them new instructions. Brandon should have left then, should have gone back to his office and kept his distance. But instead, he lingered, watching as she moved through the space, her presence commanding yet effortless. "Since you're here," she said without looking at him, "you could actually contribute instead of just standing there looking important." He let out a quiet huff of amusement. "And how exactly would I contribute?" She tossed him a measuring tape. "Hold this while I mark the placements." Brandon caught it, arching a brow. "You do realize I don't usually take orders." Zara glanced at him, a teasing glint in her eyes. "There's a first time for everything, Lancaster." So he stayed. He helped not because he had to, but because, for some reason, he wanted to. And for the first time in a long while, he wasn't thinking about business meetings or financial reports. He was just there. As the evening stretched on, the workers left one by one, until it was just the two of them. Zara was reviewing sketches at the kitchen island when he finally broke the silence. "You're good at this," he said, leaning against the counter. She didn't look up. "Thanks, I worked hard to get here." Something in her tone made him curious. "You built your career from the ground up, didn't you?" She finally met his gaze. No family connections, no shortcuts, just a lot of late nights and stubborn persistence. He nodded slowly, understanding more than she likely realized. "People assume money makes everything easier," she continued, tapping her pencil against the paper. "And maybe it does in some ways. But real success, that's earned." Brandon felt an unexpected surge of admiration. He was surrounded by people who wanted things handed to them, people who saw power and wealth as the ultimate goal. Zara, though, she wasn't impressed by any of it. "You know," she said after a moment, a playful glint returning to her eyes, "for a man who runs an empire, you're surprisingly decent at following instructions." He chuckled. "Don't get used to it." She grinned. Too late. For the second time in their brief acquaintance, Brandon found himself enjoying her company more than he should. And for the first time in a long while, he had the unsettling feeling that he was in trouble, the kind of trouble that didn't come from business deals or market fluctuations. The kind of trouble that came from meeting someone who could change everything. Brandon Lancaster was not a man who ignored his instincts. He had built his empire by following his gut, making sharp, calculated decisions that always led to success. But when it came to Zara Evans, his instincts were tangled in ways that made no sense. Days after working alongside her in his penthouse, he still found himself thinking about the way she had commanded the space, the way she had challenged him without hesitation, and most unsettling of all, the way she had made him forget about the weight of his responsibilities for a fleeting moment. He wasn't a man who got distracted. Yet here he was, standing outside a small cafe on the Lower East Side, watching through the window as Zara sat at a corner table, flipping through design samples. The space was nothing like the high-end establishments he usually frequented. No white tablecloths, no silent waiters gliding between tables. It was warm, lived in, and buzzing with quiet conversation. Before he could second-guess himself, he stepped inside. The door chimed as he entered, and Zara's head lifted. Surprise flickered across her face before she set her papers aside, folding her arms as he approached. "Brandon Lancaster," she said, tilting her head, "didn't peg you as a cafe kind of guy." He slid into the chair across from her, unbuttoning his suit jacket. "I make exceptions." She leaned back, studying him with amusement. "And what exactly are you making an exception for?" He didn't answer immediately. Instead, he glanced at the papers in front of her. "New project," her lips quirked, but she didn't push for an answer. "Potential client. If they approve the concept, it could be a big deal for my firm." Brandon considered that. He knew, better than most, how much a single client could change the trajectory of a business. "Do you need an introduction?" She raised a brow. "Are you offering to pull strings for me?" He met her gaze evenly. "I'm offering to help if you want it." For a moment, she seemed to weigh his words, as if trying to determine if there were any hidden motives. Then she shook her head, a small smile playing at her lips. "I appreciate the offer, but I built my career without shortcuts. I'll land this on my own." He expected that answer, and yet hearing it made something shift inside him. She wasn't impressed by power, wasn't interested in favors. She wanted to succeed on her own terms. "You're stubborn," he remarked. She laughed softly. "Takes one to know one." The conversation settled into an easy rhythm, flowing in a way that felt effortless. They talked about things that had nothing to do with business, places they had traveled, books they had read, the strange quirks of New York City. For the first time in years, Brandon wasn't discussing market trends or acquisition strategies. He was just talking. Somewhere between her teasing him about his lack of knowledge on classic films and him countering with a debate on modern architecture, he realized something unsettling. He liked this. Not just the conversation, not just the banter, he liked being around her, and that was dangerous. The realization must have registered on his face because Zara's expression shifted slightly. "You look like you just realized something important," she said, tilting her head. Brandon exhaled, leaning back in his chair. "I don't usually do this." "Do what?" He gestured vaguely between them. "This, sitting in a cafe, talking about things that have nothing to do with work." Her expression softened, but there was something knowing in her eyes. "Maybe that's the problem." He didn't answer, because deep down he knew she was right. Before he could dwell on it further, her phone buzzed on the table. She glanced at the screen, her forehead creasing slightly before she let out a breath. I have to go, meeting with the potential client. Brandon stood as she gathered her things. Good luck. She slung her bag over her shoulder, pausing for half a second before adding, thanks. And Brandon, he lifted a brow. You should do this more often, she said, nodding toward the cafe around them. Take a break from being Brandon Lancaster, CEO, and just be Brandon. With that, she walked out, leaving him standing in the middle of a place he didn't belong, thinking about things he never allowed himself to consider. And for the first time in a long time, he wasn't sure what his next move should be. Brandon had never been a man who let emotions dictate his actions. His life was built on logic, strategy, and control. Yet, as he sat in his office staring out at the Manhattan skyline, all he could think about was Zara. It wasn't just attraction. He'd been attracted to plenty of women before. This was different. She challenged him, made him question things he had long accepted about himself. And the worst part, he liked it. He liked her. That realization should have been unsettling, but instead it felt inevitable. A knock at the door pulled him from his thoughts. His assistant stepped inside, holding a folder. The final reports on the Lancaster Tower expansion, she said, placing it on his desk. Brandon barely glanced at it. Reschedule my afternoon meetings. She hesitated, clearly surprised. All of them, he confirmed, already reaching for his jacket. He didn't wait for a response. He was already out the door, heading toward the elevator that, weeks ago, had forced him into an encounter he hadn't realized would change everything. It didn't take long to track Zara down. He knew she was finishing up final touches on a boutique project in Soho, and when he arrived at the site, he found her deep in conversation with a contractor, gesturing toward a set of light fixtures that had just been installed. She didn't notice him at first. She was in her element, completely immersed in her work, and he took a moment just to watch her. Then, as if sensing his presence, she turned. Her eyes flickered with surprise, followed by something softer, something unreadable. Brandon, she said, tucking a stray strand of hair behind her ear, didn't expect to see you here. He stepped closer, every movement deliberate. I realized something. She raised a brow. Oh, and what's that? Brandon had spent his entire life making calculated decisions, weighing risks before taking a step. But this was the easiest decision he had ever made. I don't want to ignore this, he said, his voice steady. You, us, whatever this is, I don't want to pretend it doesn't matter. For the first time since he met her, Zara looked truly caught off guard. Her fingers tightened slightly around the folder she was holding, and for a moment, she didn't speak. Then, after what felt like an eternity, she let out a quiet breath. I wasn't sure if you'd ever admit that. He took another step forward, closing the distance between them. I've never been the kind of man who lets feelings dictate his choices, he admitted. But you changed that. Her lips parted slightly, and for the first time he saw the vulnerability beneath her usual confidence. Brandon, this isn't just some fleeting thing for you, is it? He shook his head. No. It's not. Something shifted then. The air between them grew heavier, more charged, and then, as if there was no other possible outcome, she stepped closer, tilting her head up to meet his gaze. You're impossible, she murmured, though there was no bite to her words. And you're infuriating, he countered, his hand brushing against hers. A small smile played at her lips. We really don't make sense, do we? Brandon exhaled, shaking his head. No, but I don't care. And then, without hesitation, he closed the distance between them. The moment his lips met hers, everything else faded. The world beyond the boutique, the weight of expectations, the carefully constructed walls he had spent years building, none of it mattered. She melted into him, her fingers gripping the fabric of his jacket as he deepened the kiss, pouring into it everything he hadn't been able to say. When they finally pulled apart, her forehead rested lightly against his. Well, she whispered, breathless. That was unexpected. Brandon chuckled, his fingers tracing the side of her face. Not to me. She pulled back slightly, studying him. So what happens now? He didn't hesitate. Dinner tonight, no excuses. A slow grin spread across her lips. Bossy. He tilted his head. You like it, she laughed softly, shaking her head. Fine, dinner. But if you try to impress me with some extravagant, over-the-top restaurant, I'm making you eat at a food truck. Brandon smirked. Noted. But as he walked away, already pulling out his phone to make arrangements, he knew one thing for certain. He wasn't just taking Zara to dinner. He was taking the first step toward forever. Brandon had always been a man of control. Every decision, every step, every calculated move in his life had been designed to push him further toward success. But as he walked into the cozy, hole-in-the-wall restaurant Zara had chosen for their dinner, he realized control had nothing to do with this. This was something else entirely. The warm glow of string lights overhead cast a golden hue over the rustic wooden tables. The scent of freshly baked bread and slow-cooked spices filled the air, a stark contrast from the sleek, sterile fine dining establishments he usually frequented. It was the kind of place where people laughed freely, where time slowed, where no one measured success in deals closed or numbers on a balance sheet. And yet, for the first time in years, Brandon wasn't thinking about any of that. He was thinking about her. Zara was already waiting for him at a booth near the back, flipping through the worn, handwritten menu. When she looked up, something flickered across her face, an emotion she masked quickly, but not quickly enough. He slid into the seat across from her, taking in the way she seemed at home in this place, the way she belonged in a way he never had anywhere outside of his office. Didn't think you'd actually go through with it, she said, setting the menu down. Brandon met her gaze evenly. I don't say things I don't mean. She studied him for a moment, then nodded, as if coming to some silent conclusion. All right then, Lancaster. Let's see if you can survive a night without a 5-star sommelier hovering over your shoulder. He chuckled, loosening the cuffs of his sleeves. I think I'll manage. Dinner was unlike any meal he had ever had. There was no pretentious presentation, no hushed conversations or delicate bites taken with precision. Instead, there was laughter, her laughter rich and unguarded, filling the space between them as they traded stories. Zara talked about growing up in a family that never quite understood her love for design, about how she had fought for every opportunity, proving time and again that she deserved to be exactly where she was. Brandon found himself telling her things he had never shared with anyone, the suffocating expectations of being the youngest executive in his company's history. The constant pressure to never make a mistake, the fear that if he ever stopped moving, everything he built would come crashing down. She listened, really listened, and when she finally spoke, it wasn't with empty reassurances or polite platitudes, it was with honesty. You don't have to prove anything to anyone, Brandon. Not anymore. The weight of her words settled deep, in a place he hadn't realized was aching. By the time the plates were cleared and the restaurant had started to empty, he knew. This wasn't just a fleeting attraction. This wasn't something he could walk away from, brush off as an interesting detour in his otherwise structured life. This was real, and it terrified him. Outside, the city hummed with life, neon signs flickering against the pavement as they walked side by side down the quiet street. Zara tucked her hands into her coat pockets, glancing at him with something unreadable in her expression. So did I succeed? She asked. Brandon glanced at her. At what? Getting you to step outside your world for a night. He slowed to a stop, turning to fully face her. You did more than that. Her breath hitched slightly, barely noticeable, but he caught it. Then, before logic could talk him out of it, before fear could make him retreat, he reached for her hand, threading his fingers through hers. Zara didn't pull away. Instead, she squeezed his hand, just enough to tell him she understood. And just like that, Brandon Lancaster, the man who had spent his life building walls, realized he had just let someone in. For the first time in as long as he could remember, he didn't regret it. Brandon had never lingered on a decision before. Once he chose a course of action, he followed through without hesitation. But as he stood outside Zara's apartment later that evening, the warmth of her hand still lingering in his own, he hesitated. It wasn't uncertainty. No, that was the one thing he did not feel. It was the weight of knowing that this whatever it was between them was no longer something he could set aside. Zara watched him carefully, the city lights casting a golden glow over her face. The quiet between them wasn't awkward, nor was it empty. It was charged with the kind of anticipation that neither of them wanted to name, but neither could ignore. She reached for her keys, her fingers brushing against the metal as if she were considering whether or not to break the moment. Then, instead of unlocking the door, she exhaled softly and turned to him. "This isn't what you planned for, is it?" she asked. Brandon didn't look away. "No. But I've never been more certain about anything." Something flickered in her expression, not doubt, but something deeper, something unguarded. "Good," she said simply, before reaching for his hand again. The next few weeks were unlike anything Brandon had known before. His life had always been structured, every moment accounted for, every step leading toward the next strategic move. But Zara disrupted that rhythm in the most unexpected way. She didn't fit into his world neatly, didn't mold herself to the expectations that so many others had tried to conform to. She challenged him, pushed him, made him question why he had ever thought that success meant shutting himself off from everything outside his empire. And he found that he didn't mind. She dragged him to street markets on Saturday mornings, laughing as he struggled to keep up with her enthusiasm for handcrafted furniture and obscure design pieces. He took her to exclusive events, watching with quiet admiration as she navigated the room with effortless charm, never once pretending to be anything other than herself. Somehow, their lives so different, so seemingly incompatible began to intertwine. Brandon had never been the type to rearrange his schedule for anyone. But now, he found himself carving out time he hadn't realized he had, just to be with her. It wasn't just about wanting her. It was about needing her in a way that went beyond logic, beyond reason. But with something this real, this consuming, there was always the risk of it slipping away. And the moment that risk became real, it hit harder than he could have anticipated. It happened on a night that should have been like any other. Zara had invited him to one of her smaller projects, reveals a boutique opening that she had poured months of her energy into. It wasn't the kind of event that typically made it onto his calendar, but there was no hesitation when she had asked him to be there. He arrived late, delayed by a last-minute crisis at the company, but when he stepped inside, the air was filled with a quiet sort of magic. Warm lighting, intricate decor, every piece carefully curated to create an atmosphere that felt both intimate and grand. And then he saw her. She was standing near the entrance, speaking with a group of designers, her expression alight with passion as she discussed the details of her work. But the moment she spotted him, something in her eyes shifted, not anger, not disappointment, something much worse: resignation. She excused herself from the conversation and made her way toward him, her arms crossing as she studied him. "You're late," she said. Brandon exhaled. "I know." Something came up, she held up a hand. "I get it, work, it always comes first," he frowned, stepping closer. "That's not true." She let out a quiet, almost bitter laugh. "Brandon. You don't even see it, do you?" "See what?" She shook her head, her voice softer now. "You keep saying this is different, that I'm different. But at the end of the day, you still expect me to fit into the spaces you have left over after everything else." The words hit harder than he expected. "That's not what I want," he said, his voice low. "Then what do you want?" For the first time in his life, Brandon didn't have an immediate answer. The silence stretched between them, and Zara let out a breath, stepping back. "I can't be an afterthought, Brandon," she said, her voice steady but laced with something raw. "Not for you. Not for anyone." Then, before he could find the words to fix it, she turned and walked away. Brandon had faced losses before. He had walked away from deals worth millions, had made ruthless decisions without hesitation. But this felt like the only loss that had ever truly mattered. For the first time in his life, Brandon wasn't sure if he knew how to fix something, but he knew one thing: he couldn't let her walk away, not this time. The realization hit him like a tidal wave, and for once he didn't analyze it, didn't strategize, he simply acted. The next morning, Zara arrived at her office early, expecting nothing more than a long day of meetings and deadlines. But the moment she stepped inside, she froze. Because standing there in the middle of her space was Brandon, and he wasn't alone. Behind him, a team of movers was carefully setting up something that made her heart stop: a studio. Not just any studio, a fully equipped, professionally designed space tailored specifically for her work. She turned to him, her voice barely above a whisper. "What is this?" Brandon stepped forward, his expression unreadable. "It's yours." She shook her head, struggling to process what was happening. "Brandon, I don't want you to be an afterthought," he interrupted, his voice raw. "I don't want you to fit into the spaces I have left over. I want us to be something I make room for. Something I build my life around." Her breath caught, and for the first time in weeks, she saw something in his eyes that she had never seen before. Not just desire, not just need. Commitment. Real, unwavering commitment. She took a slow step forward, uncertainty flickering across her face. "This isn't just some grand gesture, is it?" "No," he said, his voice steady. "This is me proving that when I say you matter, I mean it." Silence stretched between them, heavy with everything unspoken. Then, in one swift motion, she closed the distance between them, her arms wrapping around his neck as she kissed him with everything she had. Brandon held her tightly as if letting go wasn't an option, and in that moment he knew. This wasn't just a fleeting moment, this was forever. And for the first time in his life, forever didn't terrify him. It felt like the only thing that had ever truly made sense.